The photograph would never be taken. That was the rule, carved into the very foundation of their existence. And Sergeant Michael Hayes, 34 years old, understood this with crystalline clarity as he stood in the debriefing room at Papakura military camp, watching his commanding officer slide a manila folder across the steel table. Inside were 6 images, grainy surveillance photos from Kabul, and in 3 of them, partially visible through a car window, was Hayes' own face. Someone had been watching. Someone had been documenting. And now, 6 months after returning from Afghanistan, the war had followed him home. Hayes had joined the New Zealand Special Air Service 9 years earlier, a farm boy from Southland who had excelled in the brutally selective training where 90% of candidates failed. He remembered his mother at the departure gate, holding his face with both hands, memorizing features she would never see in newspapers, never recognize in official photographs, never search for in victory parades that would never happen. She had asked him once why Special Forces operators were different, why her son had to become a ghost, and he had told her it was about operational security. But that was the sanitized answer, the one that kept her sleeping at night. The truth was far more visceral, far more permanent, and sitting in that debriefing room with surveillance photos proving someone had tracked him, Hayes felt the full weight of what anonymity actually meant in the world of Tier 1 operators. The commanding officer, a man Hayes knew only as Colonel Richards despite working under him for 3 years, pointed to the first photograph, a marketplace in Kabul, crowded, chaotic, the kind of place where 600 people move through every hour and nobody noticed anyone. Except someone had noticed. Someone had positioned themselves with a telephoto lens at precisely the right angle to catch Hayes exiting a vehicle, turning his head for just 2 seconds, enough for the camera to capture the left side of his face and the distinctive scar running from his ear to his jaw. The second photograph showed Hayes from behind, but the angle of his shoulders, the specific way he carried himself, the pattern recognition that intelligence analysts trained for years to identify, it was all there. The third photograph was worse. Hayes' reflection in a storefront window, clear enough for facial recognition software, clear enough for someone building a target package. Richards spoke in the measured tone of a man delivering a diagnosis. These photographs had been recovered from a safe house in Helmand Province during a joint operation with British SAS 3 months ago. The safe house belonged to a Taliban intelligence cell that specialized in tracking coalition special forces. They had files on 47 operators from 6 different nations, photographs, movement patterns, known associates, family addresses. Hayes' file was 17 pages long. They knew he had a sister in Christchurch. They knew his father had died of heart disease in 2018. They knew he drove a blue Toyota when off base, and they had the license plate number. They knew which coffee shop he visited on Thursday mornings when he was in New Zealand. And they were patient, because the Taliban had learned over 20 years of war that revenge was a dish best served when operators thought they were safe, when they had retired, when they had families, when they had something to lose. This was why NZSAS operators were banned from revealing their faces, not just during active service but forever, until the grave and beyond. It was not about drama or mystique or playing at being shadows. It was about the cold mathematical reality that in the world of special operations, you accumulated enemies the way other people accumulated photographs, and those enemies had long memories, extensive networks, and the kind of patience that outlasted military careers. Hayes thought about the mission in Kabul that had put him in that marketplace, the target they had been tracking, a bomb maker responsible for 19 coalition deaths. They had eliminated the target in a compound 3 kilometers from where that photograph was taken, a surgical operation that lasted 11 minutes and left no witnesses except the ones who mattered. Except someone had been building a pattern, watching movements, documenting the ghosts. And now Hayes was compromised. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering threat assessment protocols, identity protection measures, the specific steps Hayes would need to take now that his operational security had been breached. He would need to change his routine completely, avoid patterns, consider relocating his sister, install enhanced security at his own residence, and accept that he was now on a list that would exist long after he left the military. Richards explained that this was not an isolated incident. In the past 5 years, 3 former SAS operators from Commonwealth nations had been targeted by groups with connections to organizations they had operated against. One in Australia, ambushed outside his home by men who had tracked him for 18 months. One in the United Kingdom, whose family received credible death threats that forced them into protective custody. And one in New Zealand, a retired operator who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, only to find himself looking over his shoulder in Auckland supermarkets, recognizing surveillance patterns, understanding that his war had never actually ended. Hayes left the debriefing room with a new set of protocols that would govern the rest of his life. No social media presence under his real name, no photographs at family gatherings that might be posted online, no media interviews, no book deals, no speaking engagements where his face might be captured and cross-referenced. The NZSAS had a term for this permanent state of anonymity: protected identity status, a designation that followed operators beyond retirement, beyond discharge, into civilian life and eventually into death, where even obituaries would be carefully worded to reveal nothing about service history. It was a sentence to obscurity, a guarantee that no matter what Hayes had accomplished, no matter what missions he had completed, no matter how many lives he had saved, his legacy would be officially non-existent. But Hayes had known this from the beginning, from the day he passed selection and received his sand-colored beret with the winged dagger insignia. The NZSAS was not like conventional military units where soldiers could post deployment photos, where families could display service medals, where retirement meant freedom to tell stories. The NZSAS operated in the spaces between official acknowledgement and plausible deniability, conducting missions that often never appeared in public record, targeting individuals whose deaths were attributed to drone strikes or local conflicts, gathering intelligence that shaped national security policy without ever being credited. The 70 operators currently serving in the NZSAS were effectively non-existent in public consciousness, and the hundreds who had served before them remained ghosts by necessity and design. The reason for this permanent anonymity extended beyond individual safety into the realm of operational capability. Every face revealed was a piece of intelligence that hostile organizations could exploit. Facial recognition technology had evolved to the point where a single photograph could be run through databases containing billions of images, cross-referenced with travel records, linked to associates, mapped against pattern-of-life analyses. A photograph taken at a retirement ceremony could be used to identify operators who were still active. A candid shot at a wedding could reveal family connections that became leverage points. The NZSAS had learned these lessons the hard way, through near misses and close calls, through intelligence reports showing their operators' faces circulating in dark web forums, through the Australian experience where inadequate identity protection had led to multiple security breaches. Hayes thought about the case that had made headlines 3 years earlier, though few civilians understood its implications. An Australian SAS soldier had been charged with war crimes related to operations in East Timor in 2001. The trial required witnesses, and the New Zealand Defence Force had offered to provide NZSAS operators who had been present during the relevant operations. But when the court indicated it could not guarantee full identity protection, when prosecutors suggested that NZSAS witnesses might need to testify with only partial anonymity measures, the New Zealand government made an unprecedented decision. They withdrew their witnesses entirely, allowing the case against the Australian soldier to collapse rather than expose NZSAS operators to inadequate protection. The message was clear. The identity security of NZSAS operators was non-negotiable, more important than prosecuting war crimes, more sacred than international legal cooperation. That decision had been controversial, criticized by human rights organizations and legal scholars who argued that justice should not be sacrificed for operational security. But within the special operations community, the decision was understood as the only acceptable outcome, because testifying in that courtroom, even with partial anonymity, would have created a template. It would have established that under certain circumstances, NZSAS operators could be compelled to reveal themselves. It would have opened a door that could never be closed, creating legal precedent that hostile intelligence services would exploit for decades. The New Zealand government chose to protect its ghosts, and in doing so, reinforced the fundamental principle that governed NZSAS operations. Anonymity was not a privilege that could be negotiated. It was an absolute requirement that persisted beyond service, beyond law, beyond death. Hayes drove home from Papakura military camp using a route he had never taken before, watching his mirrors with the hypervigilance that had kept him alive through 43 missions across 9 countries. The surveillance photographs had changed something fundamental in how he perceived his own life. Before, the anonymity had seemed like a reasonable security measure, a minor inconvenience in exchange for serving in the world's most elite military unit. Now, sitting at a red light in South Auckland, watching pedestrians cross the street, Hayes understood that he would never again be able to turn off the operational mindset. Every face in a crowd was a potential threat. Every vehicle that appeared twice in his rearview mirror was possible surveillance. Every person who looked at him for too long triggered threat assessment calculations that ran automatically in his subconscious. His phone rang, a secure line that only 3 people had access to. It was Sarah, his sister, the one mentioned in the Taliban intelligence file. Hayes answered and heard her voice, bright and completely unaware of the storm that was circling around her. She was calling to invite him to her daughter's birthday party next weekend, asking if he could make it, telling him that Emma would be devastated if Uncle Mike missed another celebration. Hayes listened to his sister's voice and made calculations. The party would be at a public park. There would be photographs, dozens of them, posted to social media by well-meaning relatives. His face would appear in backgrounds, in group shots, tagged and cataloged by algorithms that never forgot. And somewhere, in a compound in Pakistan or a safe house in Somalia or a basement in Jakarta, people who wanted him dead would be watching. He told Sarah he would be there because the alternative was explaining why he could not, and that explanation would require revealing truths that would terrify her. Instead, Hayes made a mental note to contact the NZSAS security team, to have them scrub social media in the days following the party, to ensure that photographs containing his image were identified and removed before they spread too far. It was an imperfect solution, reactive rather than proactive, but it was the compromise between living a semi-normal life and maintaining the absolute anonymity that perfect security required. Other operators made different choices. Hayes knew men who had completely severed contact with extended family, who attended no gatherings, who lived as hermits in remote locations where surveillance was difficult and visitors were rare. Those men had chosen survival over connection, had accepted that being a ghost meant embracing isolation so complete that they effectively disappeared from civilian life entirely. The NZSAS tried to prepare operators for this reality during the qualification course, but Hayes had learned that no amount of briefing could truly convey what permanent anonymity felt like in practice. During selection, instructors had explained the restrictions. No photographs in uniform, no social media presence, no public acknowledgement of service. It had seemed straightforward, almost quaint in its simplicity. But the reality was far more insidious. It meant watching other military units receive public recognition, while NZSAS achievements remained classified. It meant attending funerals for fallen comrades, where even the eulogies had to be carefully worded to reveal nothing about how they had actually died. It meant carrying injuries and scars that prompted questions from civilians, questions that could not be answered honestly, questions that required elaborate cover stories and careful lies. Hayes had a scar on his left shoulder from shrapnel that had nearly severed his subclavian artery during a mission in Yemen. The mission itself was so highly classified that its existence was denied by official channels. When people asked about the scar, Hayes told them it was from a training accident, a story that was technically true in that the Yemen operation had been classified as a training exercise for bureaucratic purposes, but fundamentally false in that it omitted the 18-hour firefight, the emergency field surgery performed by a medic with a penlight and morphine, The helicopter extraction under fire that had brought Hayes back from the edge of bleeding out in a desert compound 3,000 kilometers from any official New Zealand military presence. The lies accumulated like layers of sediment, building a false history that bore no resemblance to reality. Hayes sometimes thought about writing it all down, a complete record of what had actually happened, missions and operations and moments of impossible decisions. But doing so would violate every security protocol he had sworn to uphold. Other operators had tried. There were books written by former Special Forces soldiers from other nations, memoirs that revealed operational details, that named targets and described tactics. Those books often led to investigations, legal threats, and in some cases, prosecuted breaches of national security. The NZSAS made its position clear: write nothing, say nothing, confirm nothing. The operational details of NZSAS missions would remain classified for 75 years after their completion, long after everyone involved was dead, long after the context that made them necessary had faded into historical footnote. This created a strange paradox where the NZSAS was simultaneously the most respected and most unknown unit in the New Zealand Defence Force. Military professionals understood the rigorous selection process, the exceptional training standards, the combat effectiveness that made NZSAS operators among the most capable soldiers in the world. But the general public knew almost nothing. When people asked Hayes what he did for a living, he told them he worked in logistics for the Defence Force, a cover story so boring it discouraged follow-up questions. His neighbors thought he was a desk officer who occasionally deployed for routine exercises. His extended family believed he had a quiet military career that kept him traveling, but involved nothing dangerous. Only Sarah knew the truth, and even she knew only the broad outlines. Enough to understand why her brother sometimes woke up with nightmares, why he checked the locks on her doors with obsessive thoroughness, why he had taught her daughter Emma evasion techniques disguised as games. The birthday party happened on a Saturday afternoon in Hagley Park. Bright sunshine and children running through playground equipment, the kind of aggressively normal scene that felt surreal to Hayes after months of operating in conflict zones. He arrived early, scanned the perimeter with practiced efficiency, identified 3 exit routes and 2 potential choke points where an attack would be most likely. It was automatic, the tactical assessment running in the background of his consciousness, while he smiled and hugged his niece and accepted a piece of birthday cake. Hayes positioned himself carefully throughout the party, always at angles that kept his face away from cameras, moving whenever someone pulled out a phone, the constant dance of avoiding documentation while trying to appear normal and present. Emma was turning 7, and she looked at her uncle with adoration that made Hayes's chest tighten. She did not know that Uncle Mike had killed 19 people in the past year alone, that he had burned fingerprints off corpses to prevent identification, that he carried a weapon even at children's birthday parties, because paranoia was the price of survival. Emma knew only that her uncle traveled for work, brought her interesting presents from strange places, and sometimes taught her things like how to remember escape routes and how to recognize when someone was following her. Hayes told himself he was preparing her for a world that was more dangerous than her parents wanted to acknowledge, but he knew the truth was more complicated. He was teaching his 7-year-old niece counter-surveillance techniques because she was in the Taliban intelligence file, because her connection to him made her a potential target, because the anonymity that was supposed to protect Hayes had already failed, and now the people he loved lived in the shadow of his enemies. Sarah caught him during a quiet moment, while Emma was occupied with presents. His sister looked at him with the expression she had worn since they were children, the look that said she could see through whatever story Hayes was telling. She asked if everything was okay, and Hayes considered telling her about the photographs, about the Taliban file, about the fact that her address was documented in a safe house in Afghanistan. But instead he smiled and told her everything was fine, work was busy, nothing to worry about. Sarah did not believe him, he could see that in her eyes, but she did not push. The agreement between them had always been that Hayes would tell her what he could, and she would not ask about what he could not. But the agreement was fraying. 2 weeks after the birthday party, Hayes was called back to Papakura for another briefing. This time, there were additional personnel in the room. Intelligence specialists from the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service, analysts who specialized in counter-terrorism threat assessment. They had new information. The Taliban cell that had been building files on Special Forces operators had been more extensive than initially assessed. They had identified 23 NZSAS operators currently serving, and another 41 who had retired in the past 15 years. The cell had been planning a coordinated operation, targeting multiple operators simultaneously in what intelligence analysts called a spectacular, an attack designed for maximum psychological impact. The operation had been disrupted by the safehouse raid that recovered the files, but the intelligence itself had been shared before the disruption. Copies of the files existed in at least 3 other locations, possibly more, and there was evidence that the information had been sold to other organizations. Hayes listened to this briefing with growing understanding that his anonymity was not just permanently compromised, it was actively circulating in networks that specialized in revenge and retribution. The analysts explained that this was the new reality of special operations warfare. Advanced surveillance technology, facial recognition software, social media data mining, all of it had made traditional anonymity protocols increasingly difficult to maintain. Hostile organizations were adapting, learning to track ghosts, finding the seams in security measures that had been adequate 20 years ago, but were now dangerously insufficient. The NZSAS response was to double down on identity protection. New protocols were implemented that restricted operators' movements even further, that required security teams to conduct regular sweeps of social media for compromising images, that established procedures for operators to change addresses, alter appearances, and in extreme cases adopt new legal identities. Hayes was offered this option: a complete identity change, new name, new background, relocation to a different city, severance of all previous relationships including family contact. It was witness protection for soldiers, a chance to disappear so completely that even the Taliban files would lead to dead ends. Hayes considered the offer for 3 days. He thought about Sarah and Emma, about the life he had built in the gaps between deployments, about whether anonymity was worth losing everyone who knew his real name. In the end, he declined. He would maintain enhanced security measures, would accept the restrictions and the constant vigilance, but he would not erase himself completely. Other operators made different choices. Hayes heard through unofficial channels that 2 men from his selection class had accepted new identities, had disappeared into civilian life so thoroughly that even their former teammates could not find them. Those men had decided that being a ghost meant accepting total invisibility, and perhaps they were right. Perhaps that was the only rational response to being on a Taliban hit list that would outlast any military career. But Hayes could not do it. He had already sacrificed recognition, had already accepted that his achievements would never be publicly acknowledged, that his service record would remain classified long after his death. Erasing his identity entirely felt like a final surrender, an admission that the enemy had won by forcing him to stop existing. So instead, Hayes learned to live as a compromised ghost, maintaining just enough connection to civilian life to feel human, while accepting security restrictions that would have seemed paranoid to anyone outside the special operations community. The restrictions extended into retirement in ways that surprised even veterans of the NZSAS. When operators left active service, they were required to sign additional non-disclosure agreements that bound them to silence for the rest of their lives. These agreements covered not just operational details, but identity protection protocols, forbidding retired operators from confirming or denying their service in the NZSAS, from attending reunions that might be photographed, from accepting recognition or awards that would require public acknowledgement. Violation of these agreements carried severe penalties, including prosecution under national security legislation, but the real enforcement mechanism was more subtle. Operators who violated anonymity protocols endangered their former teammates, and that knowledge was more binding than any legal contract. Hayes knew retired operators who had been out of the military for 15 years and still maintained cover stories, who still avoided cameras, who still checked their six and varied their routes, and lived with the constant awareness that their war had never ended. One man, a veteran of East Timor operations in 2001, had moved to rural Southland and lived on a property with 3 kilometers of visibility in every direction, with security cameras and motion sensors and a response plan for every possible approach vector. Another man had left New Zealand entirely, relocating to Australia where he lived under a different name and maintained no contact with anyone from his previous life. These were not paranoid responses. They were rational adaptations to a threat environment that persisted long after the shooting stopped. The case that defined the NZSAS approach to identity protection had happened in 2022, when the New Zealand government faced the impossible choice between justice and security. An Australian SAS soldier named Person 81, his identity protected by court order, had been charged with war crimes relating to the execution of an unarmed prisoner in East Timor in 2001. The incident had occurred during a joint operation between Australian and New Zealand Special Forces, and NZSAS operators had been present. Australian prosecutors wanted those operators to testify, to provide evidence that would corroborate the charges, to help deliver justice for a man who had been killed in violation of the laws of war. But the courtroom security offered to NZSAS witnesses was inadequate. The proposal involved screens to hide witnesses from the public gallery, voice modulation to disguise their testimony, but no protection of their full identity from defense counsel, from court officials, from the network of people involved in a high-profile war crimes prosecution. The New Zealand Defence Force assessed the security measures and determined they were insufficient. There was too much risk of exposure, too many points where an NZSAS operator's identity could be compromised, too many people who would learn names and faces and details that could be exploited. The Chief of Defence Force made a decision that shocked the Australian legal system. New Zealand would not provide witnesses. The NZSAS operators who had been present during the East Timor operation would not testify, regardless of the impact on the prosecution. The case against Person 81 collapsed. Without the New Zealand witnesses, Australian prosecutors could not prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. A man accused of executing a prisoner in cold blood walked free because the New Zealand government decided that protecting the identity of its special forces operators was more important than securing a war crimes conviction. The decision was condemned by human rights organizations, criticized by legal scholars, and celebrated in quiet corners of the special operations community as the definitive statement that anonymity was absolute. The New Zealand government had drawn a line in the sand. NZSAS identity protection was non-negotiable, more sacred than alliance obligations, more important than justice in a foreign courtroom. The message rippled through intelligence networks and hostile organizations that tracked special forces operators. New Zealand's ghosts were protected at the highest levels, and anyone who thought that protection might falter under political or legal pressure had been proven catastrophically wrong. For Hayes, watching the case unfold from a distance, the decision represented both validation and burden. Validation that the restrictions he lived under, the anonymity he maintained, the relationships he sacrificed, all of it was supported by a government willing to accept international criticism rather than compromise operator security. But also burden, because the case made clear that Hayes and his teammates were considered so valuable, so irreplaceable, that war crimes prosecutions would be allowed to fail rather than risk their exposure. That knowledge came with weight, the understanding that being a ghost was not just about personal safety, but about a government investment in maintaining an operational capability that existed in the shadows. The NZSAS had 70 operators at any given time, an extraordinarily small force even by special operations standards. The British SAS had approximately 250 operators. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had approximately 500. The United States Delta Force had approximately 250. But the NZSAS maintained just 70, each one selected through a qualification process so brutal that completion rates averaged below 10%. each one trained to a standard that made them interoperable with Tier 1 special mission units from allied nations. Those 70 men represented an outsized capability for a nation of 5 million people, a strategic asset that enabled New Zealand to contribute meaningfully to international special operations, despite having a relatively small military. Protecting those 70 ghosts and the hundreds who had served before them became a matter of national security policy. The New Zealand government had determined that Special Forces capability was essential to maintaining strategic relationships with allies, to contributing to counterterrorism operations, to having influence in international security discussions. And that capability rested entirely on the ability of NZSAS operators to work in complete anonymity, to conduct missions that were never officially acknowledged, to eliminate targets without leaving evidence that traced back to New Zealand. Compromise operator identity, and you compromise the entire capability. Expose one face and you endangered 70 active operators, plus hundreds of veterans whose knowledge and experience remained valuable for training, planning, and advising. Hayes understood this calculus intellectually, but living it was different. 3 years after the surveillance photographs from Kabul, after the enhanced security measures and the constant vigilance, Hayes left active service. His retirement was marked by a small ceremony at Papakura military camp, attended by approximately 20 people, none of whom could be photographed, none of whom would be named in any official record. Hayes received a plaque that contained no mention of his specific achievements, no list of operations, no accounting of the 43 missions across 9 countries. The plaque simply thanked him for 12 years of dedicated service to the New Zealand Defence Force. It was the kind of generic recognition that could apply to any soldier in any unit, deliberately vague, carefully nonspecific. But in the unofficial moments after the ceremony, Hayes's teammates told him the stories that would never be written down. They reminded him of the mission in Afghanistan, where his split-second decision had saved 4 lives. They recounted the operation in Somalia, where Hayes had held a position alone for 3 hours, while the team extracted a high-value target. They spoke about the time in Syria when Hayes had talked a terrified informant through a dead drop under direct surveillance, using nothing but memory and improvisation to complete an intelligence operation that prevented a major terrorist attack. These stories would never be told outside the small community of people who had been there, who understood the context, who carried the same burden of invisible service. Hayes transitioned to civilian life with a cover story that remained intact. He had worked in logistics, nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. He found employment with a security consulting firm that quietly employed former special operations personnel and understood the unique requirements of maintaining anonymity while leveraging specialized skills. Hayes could not list his actual experience on a resume, could not use NZSAS service as a credential, could not reference the missions that would have made him immediately hireable by any organization needing expertise in high-threat environments. Instead, he relied on networks, on whispered recommendations within the special operations community, on employers who understood that sometimes the most qualified candidates had resumes that revealed almost nothing. He bought a house in a suburb of Christchurch, a modest property with good sight lines and limited approach vectors, the kind of tactical considerations that never left his assessment process. Hayes maintained contact with Sarah and Emma, but carefully, always aware that his presence in their lives carried risk. He attended Emma's school events by arriving late and leaving early, positioned himself at the back where cameras were less likely to capture him, declined to appear in family photos that would be shared online. It was a compromise existence, neither fully present nor completely absent, the life of a part-time ghost who tried to maintain human connections while accepting that he could never be fully known by the people who loved him. The nightmares persisted. Hayes would wake at 3 in the morning with his hand reaching for a weapon that was not there, his mind caught in the loop of a firefight from 4 years ago, or a close call from 6 years ago, or a moment of impossible decision from 8 years ago. The missions blended together in his memory, creating a composite experience of violence and tension that had no clear beginning or end. Hayes tried therapy, but the therapist could not be told what had actually happened, could not be given the context that would make the nightmares comprehensible. So instead they talked around the trauma, discussing stress and hypervigilance and transition challenges in abstract terms that captured nothing of the specific reality Hayes carried. Other retired operators managed differently. Some found solace in extreme sports, channeling the adrenaline addiction into activities that provided intensity without lethality. Some withdrew completely, disappearing into remote locations where they could live without the constant mask of normalcy. Some struggled badly, self-medicating with alcohol or drugs, the transition from elite warrior to invisible civilian proving too jarring, too complete. The NZSAS tried to provide support, but resources were limited, and the requirement for anonymity made traditional veteran services difficult to access. How could you attend group therapy for combat trauma when you could not tell the group where you had served or what you had done? Hayes marked time by Emma's birthdays. 7 became 8, 8 became 9, and with each year his niece grew older. Hayes felt the weight of what she did not know about him. Emma understood that Uncle Mike had been in the Army, that he had traveled to dangerous places, that sometimes he seemed sad in ways that normal adults were not. But she did not know that her uncle had ended lives, that he carried scars from wounds that should have been fatal, that he lived with the constant awareness of being on lists maintained by organizations that specialized in revenge. Hayes wondered sometimes what would happen if Emma ever learned the truth, whether she would understand the necessity of what he had done, whether she would see him as a protector or something darker. The answer came unexpectedly when Emma turned 13. She had become interested in current events, in military history, in the wars that appeared in news headlines. One afternoon, while Hayes was visiting Sarah's house, Emma asked him directly, "Were you in the SAS?" Hayes felt the question like a physical impact. He looked at his niece, this teenager who was too perceptive for comfortable lies, and made a calculation. The protocol was to deny, to maintain the cover story, to reveal nothing. But Emma was not a stranger asking casual questions. She was family who lived with the consequences of Hayes's service, whether she understood them or not. Hayes took a long breath and told Emma that he could not answer that question, that there were things about his service he was not allowed to discuss, and that he needed her to trust him when he said the restrictions were in place for good reasons. Emma studied him with an intensity that reminded Hayes of interrogation training, and then she nodded. "Okay," she said, "but if you were, theoretically, in a unit like that, I would want you to know that I think it's unfair that you can't talk about it, that people don't know what you did." Hayes felt something break open in his chest, a knot of tension that had been there for years. He told Emma that fairness was not really the point, that some things mattered more than recognition, and that keeping people safe sometimes meant staying invisible. Emma hugged him then, and Hayes realized that his niece understood more than he had given her credit for, that she had been watching and noticing and piecing together truth from the gaps in his cover story. That conversation changed something in Hayes's relationship with his family. Not disclosure, exactly, but acknowledgement of the space around disclosure. Sarah began making small accommodations without being asked, positioning Hayes away from cameras at family gatherings, understanding when he needed to leave events early, not pressing when he declined invitations to high-visibility celebrations. It was a silent negotiation, a way of honoring Hayes's service without explicitly naming it, and it made the burden of anonymity slightly more bearable. But the threat remained constant. 6 years after retirement, Hayes received a call from NZSAS security personnel, warning him that his name had appeared on a list recovered during a raid in Indonesia. The list contained 43 names, all Special Forces operators from coalition nations, with details about their current locations and routines. Hayes's entry noted that he lived in Christchurch, drove a gray Ford, and had family in the area. The information was 2 years out of date, which meant Hayes had managed to stay ahead of surveillance through constant vigilance and security measures. But the fact that he remained on active target lists 6 years after retirement proved that anonymity was not paranoia. It was survival. Hayes implemented another round of security upgrades, changed his vehicle, altered his routine, and lived with the knowledge that he would likely remain on target lists for the rest of his life. The enemies he had made during 12 years of special operations would not forget, would not forgive, would continue watching for opportunities that might come decades after the missions that created the enmity. This was the permanent cost of being a ghost. You could never stop being one, could never emerge into full daylight, could never declare victory and move on. The war continued in slow motion, a lifelong game of avoiding detection, of staying ahead of surveillance, of hoping that security measures remained adequate as technology evolved and threat actors adapted. Hayes watched other veterans struggle with this reality. One man, a former teammate who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, made the decision to violate anonymity protocols by giving an interview to a military history researcher. The interview revealed no operational details, contained no classified information, simply confirmed that the veteran had served in the NZSAS during specific time periods. But it was enough to trigger an investigation, enough to prompt a formal warning from the Defense Force, and enough to compromise the veteran's security by confirming his identity to anyone who was watching. The man spent the next 2 years looking over his shoulder with renewed intensity, understanding that he had made himself visible, that he had stepped out of the shadows, and that doing so had consequences that could not be undone. Hayes used that incident as a reminder of why the restrictions existed, why they persisted beyond retirement, why the NZSAS maintained such stringent control over operator identity. It was not about institutional control or unnecessary secrecy. It was about the mathematical certainty that every face revealed, every identity confirmed, every operator who stepped into public visibility created a vulnerability that hostile intelligence services would exploit. The NZSAS had learned through painful experience that special operations forces existed in a unique threat environment, where anonymity was not a luxury but an operational requirement, where recognition was not an honor but a security breach, where fame could be lethal. 23 years after retiring from active service, Hayes attended a funeral for a former teammate who had died of cancer at 56 years old. The funeral was held at a private location with security measures that would have seemed excessive for anyone who did not understand the context. Approximately 40 people attended, all of them current or former NZSAS operators, all of them living under the same protocols of permanent anonymity. There were no photographs, no media presence, no public announcement. The eulogy was delivered by the man's brother, who had been authorized to know the truth about his sibling's service, and who spoke about courage and sacrifice without mentioning specific operations or revealing details that remained classified decades after they had occurred. Hayes stood among his former teammates and understood that this was how all of them would end. Quiet funerals attended by people who understood but could never speak publicly, lives of extraordinary accomplishment that would never be officially recorded, legacies that existed only in the memories of people who had been there. The man they were burying had participated in operations that prevented terrorist attacks, that saved civilian lives, that shaped the security environment of an entire region. But his obituary in the newspaper would mention only that he had worked in government service, nothing specific, nothing that revealed the truth of what he had contributed. After the funeral, Hayes drove home thinking about legacy and what it meant when your achievements could never be acknowledged. He thought about the missions that would remain classified for another 50 years, about the lives saved by operations that officially never happened, about the enemy combatants eliminated by soldiers whose names would never be known. Hayes understood intellectually that the work mattered regardless of recognition, that preventing attacks was valuable whether or not anyone knew who had done the preventing. But there was still a human cost to invisibility, a price paid in the quiet moments when you wondered whether your sacrifice meant anything if nobody knew about it. Emma, now 31 years old with a daughter of her own, had asked Hayes once what he wanted his legacy to be. Hayes had thought about the question for a long time before answering that he hoped his legacy was simply the absence of terrible things, attacks that did not happen, crises that were prevented, harm that was stopped before it began. Emma had understood immediately what he meant, that sometimes the greatest achievements were the disasters that never occurred, the tragedies that were quietly averted by people working in shadows. She told Hayes that his legacy was visible in the people he had saved, even if those people never knew his name, even if history would never record his contribution, even if his grandchildren would know him only as an elderly man who had worked for the government and preferred not to discuss his career. The NZSAS would never publicly acknowledge Hayes's service. There would be no medal ceremony broadcast on television, no documentary featuring his missions, no memorial with his name inscribed alongside his achievements. When Hayes died, whenever that might be, his funeral would be small and private, attended by people bound by the same oaths of secrecy he had lived under. His obituary would reveal almost nothing, and within a generation, the specific details of what he had accomplished would fade from living memory into classified archives that would remain sealed until the 22nd century. This was the price of being a ghost, the cost of permanent anonymity, the sacrifice that continued beyond retirement, beyond death, into a future where Hayes's grandchildren might never know the truth about what their grandfather had done. But standing in the cemetery after his teammate's funeral, Hayes understood that this obscurity was not tragedy. It was choice. Every operator who passed NZSAS selection understood the requirement for anonymity, accepted the restrictions, and chose to serve despite knowing they would never receive public recognition. They made that choice because some missions required people willing to work in shadows, because certain threats could only be addressed by soldiers who would never appear in victory parades, because protecting a nation sometimes meant accepting that the nation would never know who had protected them. Hayes had made that choice at 23 years old, had lived with its consequences for 32 years, and would carry it to his grave. And if he had the choice again, knowing everything he knew now about the cost and the burden and the permanent weight of invisible service, Hayes understood with absolute certainty that he would make the same decision. Because some warriors were meant to be remembered, their names carved into monuments, their deeds recorded in history. But other warriors were meant to be ghosts, their faces hidden, their achievements secret, their legacy measured not in glory but in the quiet continuation of safety that most people took for granted. Hayes was a ghost, had always been a ghost, would remain a ghost until the end. And for people like him, for the 70 operators currently serving and the hundreds who had served before them, that anonymity was not a burden to be resented but a duty to be honored, a requirement of service to something larger than personal recognition, a sacrifice made willingly by people who understood that being invisible was the price of being effective. The NZSAS would continue protecting its ghosts, denying their existence, maintaining the fiction that these extraordinary soldiers were nothing more than logistics personnel, or training cadre, or administrative staff. The government would continue refusing to compromise operator identity, even when that refusal meant allowing war crimes prosecutions to collapse, even when international allies complained about lack of cooperation, even when the public questioned why secrecy persisted decades after missions had concluded. Because the calculus was clear. 70 active operators represented a capability that New Zealand could not afford to lose, and protecting that capability required absolute commitment to anonymity, a commitment that persisted beyond individual service, beyond institutional memory, into a future where Hayes's great-grandchildren might never know that the quiet old man in family photographs had once been one of the most dangerous soldiers in the world. If this story opened your eyes to the invisible sacrifices made by those who serve in the shadows, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what it means to be a warrior without recognition. These operators will never receive the glory they've earned, but we can honor their choice by understanding the weight they carry. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the real cost of protecting a nation, and subscribe so you never miss stories about the heroes history will never name. Because sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the ones nobody will ever know about.